So we will start today with Miss Sally Tyldesley from Concern Worldwide UK, and she's going to present on disaster reduction in fragile contexts and operational perspective. So, Sally, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Could I just check, do I press this to go on?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see if this works. Morning everyone, and sorry to interrupt your emailing to talk to you a bit about an NGO perspective on building resilience in fragile contexts. Okay, I don't know how to use the button. Got it. So what I'll be talking about, I'm going to give a quick introduction to Concern Worldwide so that you know why I'm here talking to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about why fragile contexts, the characteristics of a fragile context and what that means for working there operationally, before pulling out 4 main lessons from Concern's programmatic experiences in those contexts, using a couple of case studies from our programs to try to illustrate them. And then I'm going to go on to talk a bit about the key questions that we're currently thinking about, that I'm sure others here are thinking about as well, and it would be great to kind of tap into the hive mind of the global platform to come up with some answers on. So who is Concern Worldwide? We're an international humanitarian organisation founded in Ireland around 50 years ago and currently working in around 25 countries around the world. We're committed to working with the poorest and most marginalised people to eradicate extreme poverty, and we do that through long-term development programming, emergency response, and through advocacy. So why fragile context? Concern is increasingly operating in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Globally, we've made progress on a number of symptoms of extreme poverty, from malnutrition to disaster mortality, but progress has not been universal. I've heard a few of these stats over the last week at this conference, but I think it's worth restating them. So 58% of people killed by disasters live in the world's 30 most fragile states. 60% of people facing acute food insecurity are in countries affected by conflict or fragility. An analysis from the OECD indicates that without action, more than 80% of the world's poorest people will be living in fragile contexts by 2030. It's clear that without investing in long-term resilience and poverty alleviation alongside humanitarian assistance, these populations are and will be further left behind. We have seen increasing recognition of the importance of addressing fragility and conflict, including within the global platform process, but we've got a long way to go. And as these stats indicate, at the moment only 35% of overseas development assistance goes to countries where 75% of the world's poorest live. Middle income countries receive 10 times more ODA per person living in extreme poverty than low income countries. And in terms of disaster risk reduction, in fragile affected states, for every $100 of emergency aid spent after a disaster, just $1.30 is spent on disaster risk reduction beforehand. So in terms of the characteristics of a fragile state, fragility can take many forms: social, political, economic, security, and environmental. And many countries, including the countries that Concern works in, will experience a combination of all of these. And what this looks like in practice: firstly, weak governance structures, where government is still forming policies and structures, or where government doesn't necessarily have control of the whole country. A volatile security context, which makes access difficult, high risk, and logistically very expensive. They can experience climatic shocks of a variety of kinds, which routinely undermine people's livelihoods and cause displacement, and with climate change making that climate increasingly uncertain and variable. There's also incredibly high level of need, where large populations are food insecure and internally displaced. And there's also a characteristic of high dependence on ODA. So on average, overseas development assistance makes up around 40% of international finance flows into countries in protracted crisis, compared to roughly 3% for other developing countries. So moving on to concerns lessons, the first lesson that I wanted to pull out is that because of the weak governance structures, working with local partners and systems is incredibly important. And this means thinking beyond just formal governance systems to working with community-based organisations. Community-based organisations, as again we've heard many times this week, are the first port of call in a crisis. They're essential for expanding the reach of programs, they have local knowledge, and they can foster community acceptance. Where possible, Concern tries to link that community approach to existing national or regional level governance processes and policies. The picture that I've included here is from a program in Pakistan, and it's of a community disaster management formation meeting as part of a consortium that we're involved in called Building Disaster Resilience in Pakistan, imaginatively. We're implementing this program with a local partner called Health Foundation in 9 districts. And this project has a focus on community-based disaster risk management interventions, which build and maintain the disaster response capacity at the local level, as well as support engagement in more resilient livelihoods. But then because we're working in a consortium, we can also make links to the provincial and national government structures and policies to make sure that that local level capacity can complement and link into existing systems. I think we've learned a lot over the last few years about the different elements that build resilience capacity, so through natural capital, human capital, financial, physical and social capital. But I think one of the key things that has really come out for us is the importance of building personal resilience and self-reliance, particularly in contexts where there isn't necessarily that social safety net. So the example that I'm using here is from our Building Resilient Communities in Somalia program, where we have been applying this self-help group approach, which is essentially a community saving and lending format. And the way that we do this is we have the individual self-help groups, but then we also bring them together at a group level that we call cluster level associations. And this has meant that beyond income generation, participation in the groups has strong impacts on women's empowerment, social capital, and decision making. And it offers this programmatic approach to refocus efforts on building social capital and agency and aspiration. By bringing them together at that local, at the kind of group level, it can also facilitate broader participation in social, economic, and political spheres at the community and district level, and adds an additional kind of lobby for women, and allows advocacy at the macro level for pro-poor financial products among formal financial institutions. The third key lesson that I wanted to highlight is around adaptability. So in fragile states, there's a real risk to loss of investments and progress made by communities if we fail to acknowledge and work on the shocks and stresses faced. For example, through conflict sensitivity approaches and understanding how to mitigate the effects of regular climatic shocks. Again, I'm using the example of the Building Resilient Communities in Somalia, which is based on a flexible and adaptive program design, which aims to respond to the changing needs of communities within this reality of recurring and varying shocks. We need to be able to preempt likely shocks and mitigate their potential impact by taking an early warning and early action approach, which pulls together external climatic analysis and predictions with community level expertise and knowledge. So for example, in late 2016, when we were becoming worried about drought and noting conditions that were similar to the pre-2011 famine, Concern took preemptive early action through a system that we called red flagging, which identified communities that were especially vulnerable and made a transition to preemptive activities such as fodder production to minimize livestock deaths, construction of water catchments through Cash for Work, and then unconditional cash grants to the poorest households to avoid negative coping strategies like panic selling of assets and skipping meals. But then we also need to be able to rapidly scale up to emergency response in fragile states. So in Somalia in 2017, we did this especially through the provision of large-scale multi-purpose cash transfers via mobile money. But this relies, of course, on donors making available large-scale funding in a timely way, and then for NGOs having the organisational structures and systems in place for rapid emergency scale-up, including surge capacity. This brings me on to the fourth lesson from our programmes, and that's really linked to this last point around NGO and donor collaboration. The reality of the challenges in fragile contexts mean that adaptable approaches are not possible without strong NGO and donor collaboration. Our Building Resilient Communities in Somalia programme was only able to respond reactively because of the long-term, flexible approach that was set up by the programme. NGOs require sustained humanitarian access and predictable, flexible funding for both emergency response and longer-term resilience building. And there's still a lot of work to do on this. So we hope that NGOs and donors continue to collaborate to design and learn from lessons from existing programs to really rethink how we work in these contexts. In fragile contexts, we also call on the support of donors and the UN to use their influence to create an environment that's conducive to effective humanitarian program for removing the barriers to access to communities in need of assistance, as well as other political challenges faced in the operational environment. So that brings me on to the what next. So looking ahead, there remain a number of challenges and questions for how to build resilience and effectively do disaster risk reduction in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And I wanted to use this platform to share some of our lessons, but these are the key questions that we are keen to work on and learn from others on. So the first question, the question of scale. We're increasingly thinking about how to work at a systems level to build resilience. And I would be fascinated to know how others are approaching this, what new and different collaborations and ways of working we might need to do this effectively. Secondly, the impact of conflict on resilience building. A lot of progress has been made on this, but there's still a huge gap in terms of understanding the complex ways in which conflict affects people's resilience at the individual and long-term level, and how efforts to build resilience might need to be changed because of those effects. And this is something that we're going to be doing active research on as part of our programs, including conflict sensitivity. But again, it would be really interesting to learn the lessons that others have on this piece of work. And finally, responsive programming and turning early warning into early action. So this is something that we are doing as part of our programs, but it's very difficult. And so we'd be really keen to continue to work with others on this as well. What good practice is out there? And what experiences do others have of turning early warning into early action? What are the indicators and processes that we need in different contexts? For example, what are the differences between urban early action and rural early action? What are the indicators that we need? I think I might be out of time, but I will be around here if you have any questions or want to talk to me about any of the questions that you've raised. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. So any questions from the audience or any reflection or comment for Sally, please? Okay, we have two for you.
Well, thank you very much for sharing this experience. My name is Jeroen. I work for ACT Alliance. One of the approaches we have been implementing is survivor and community-led response with similar elements as you refer to, like using community groups, having their as first responders and as taking action. A question on the adaptability. How are the community groups involved in signaling early action and starting the early action, actually? Thank you very much.
Is this working? So the red flagging approach that I mentioned, the red flags can be raised not only through changes in the climatic system, but also through the community groups. So they identify their own indicators in terms of what they have their own sort of community-managed disaster risk reduction plan, and within that they have identified their own indicators around what indicators they look for the early actions that they're going to be implementing, what early actions for external support. And so when those indicators start being triggered, that's when they will red flag. So it is very much a kind of community-driven red flagging process as well that will guide that early action. And the responses that we do are also very much guided by that community-managed process.
So there's one more question for you.
Thank you, madam. My name is Ajay. I am representing National Dalit Watch India. I'm trying to understand this defining fragility. For example, in your presentation, you mostly on poor and poor income, basically economic definition of fragility. So are you considering other forms of like structural forms of inequality? For example, I am representing Dalits. There are 240 million caste affected people in South Asia. They are facing it because the early action and early warning will determine on accepting and understanding the structural forms of discriminations like caste, tribals, those kind of settings.
Just to say that I completely agree. And when we think about fragility, although I guess the stats that I used there were very much economic, we do think about it in much broader terms than just economic. And I think one of the things that we're definitely, so I mentioned kind of environmental, security, political, social, which I think would incorporate some of the things that you mentioned. But then when we're thinking about our resilience programming, we try to base that very much on a kind of context analysis, which will look at those different drivers of marginalization and what the impacts would be on the communities that we're working with. So yeah, completely agree.
Okay, thank you very much, Salim. Yeah.